Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Effectively Managing the Trauma That Comes from Reporting on Trauma. This is the 8th and final webinar in the America East News Media Summit webinar series. My name is Mary Firestone, and I am the Manager of Meetings and Member Services for the Pennsylvania News Media Association. The PNA has organized a series of complimentary webinars that have featured much of the content that was originally scheduled for the America East Summit, and that was canceled for the coronavirus pandemic. Today's session will be recorded, and we will be sharing the link to that recording in a follow-up communication later this week. In today's session, our speakers, Naseem Miller of the Orlando Sentinel, Elana Newman of the University of Tulsa, and Scott Blanchard from WITF will provide essential tips for reporters to ensure your own physical and emotional well-being as it relates to performing the duties of your job, as well as the information about mental health and providing coping strategies, as well as details about support groups, both externally and within your own media organization. The session will be moderated by New Yang from Editor and Publisher. And now I'll pass over the session to our first speaker, Scott Blanchard.
Hi, everyone. Good to be here, and thanks for joining us. I think just a quick introduction before I share my screen. I'll go through a couple of slides. I joined WITF about 3 years ago as the editor of State Impact Pennsylvania, which is a collaboration, statewide collaboration covering energy and the environment. But before that, I was at the York Daily Record in York, PA for 16 and a half years. And what I'll do today is tell you a little bit about how we try to integrate trauma awareness and peer support into our newsroom's culture. And I think part of my role here in this webinar is to encourage newsrooms to look at this as a skill building opportunity, the same way that you would build skills in any other journalistic area. And I think it will help make your newsroom stronger. And so let me see if I can get my slides up. All right, you hopefully are seeing that. And let me do the slideshow here. And I've had, this comes a lot of this is built on my training at the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma at Columbia University, and working with Bruce Shapiro, the executive director, and also Elana, and keeping up those connections and that learning, and then also being connected to a nonprofit that we're trying to get off the ground called the Trust for Trauma Journalism. So, why we think this is important? We all, journalists, all newsrooms cover the kinds of stories where we really run up against some difficult things. It could be a car crash, or now with COVID, people losing family members or loved ones to COVID. So we're all involved with that in one way or another. I just went a little too fast. And now, to add to that, we now have to worry about, journalists have to worry about being exposed to the virus just in doing our jobs, and then also the risk of assault and or arrest when we cover things like police brutality protests, and those things have certainly happened to journalists on the ground, as we all know. And then another layer of that is that journalists, who have a personal, for whom these events have had a personal meaning, may be particularly at risk for some difficulty in processing what they're covering in their jobs. And so trauma awareness and peer support can help individual journalists and newsrooms really strengthen the skills and the resilience that we all need to continue to report on these stories that are so vital for our communities. Help us do it better. This is a quote that has always resonated with me from Bruce Shapiro, especially the part in bold. Again, it goes back to the idea that you can build resilience and you can build your skills to tackle the toughest stories that we do. It's something we can get better at if we pay attention to it and if we learn about it and put our minds to it. So I'd just like to start off with that. Digging into trauma awareness and peer support connects us with the journalism the best of the journalism that we want to do and best practices to do that. I think the more we know about trauma and how it affects people, the better we're going to be able to do our jobs, and thus the better public service we do for our communities. It's about getting in touch with our own experiences. By making this part of your culture, you're inviting staffers to lead and help set the tone in your newsroom, to contribute to decision making. That can lead to a stronger and healthier staff. And then connected with that, we're talking about staff care and development, and that's a big deal, as we all know, and keeping good journalists, especially diverse good journalists, in the business and doing this incredibly important job. So as I said before, news organizations can make this part of how you do your work and integrate it into all of the things we all try to get better at all the time. And I've always argued that this should have a place at the table. This should be one of those things. So when we talk about trauma awareness, it's basically learning more about trauma and learning about best practices for covering trauma survivors and others who experience it, and how that's different from covering City Hall or what have you. And peer support focuses on learning how to be watchful for your colleagues and when they might be experiencing some distress, and how to support them when that happens. To dig a little deeper on trauma awareness, as I said, the more we can learn about what trauma does to people who experience it and survive it, both individually and to broader communities, I think that helps us. That helps deepen our coverage, make our coverage more authentic, give it a chance to be more authentic. We will learn how trauma affects the decisions that we make when we report and when we use visuals. We focus on really learning how journalists can get the best, the deepest, the most authentic story while respecting the people who are going through the experience. There are best practices around that. And excuse me, sorry about that. And trauma-aware reporting, I think, and I've experienced this, will challenge a newsroom to give up some of the control that we normally like to have as journalists, and that we think is important, and it is. But in this case, we look at things a little bit differently, and we may act a little bit differently in the service of getting that resonant story while respecting and understanding what the person may be going through. Peer support draws on the resilient people in your newsroom and uses shared experience intentionally to help strengthen your newsroom before Bruce Shapiro at the Dart Center likes to say before, during, and after, that this is really not something that I would say, and I think Bruce would say, and maybe Elana as well, and others here, but it's not something to think about when something really difficult happens. It's something to think about now, so you can build your skills and your resilience, so that during that difficult period of coverage, you're best equipped to deal with it and to report on it and to do great work, and then you're best equipped to process it afterward and help your newsroom move forward with what they've learned. And peer support is about checking in with your staff and knowing what to watch for and how to do it and how to have a structured conversation, which we may be able to touch on a little bit later. Some strategies that you could adopt if you want to go down this road a little bit more. Of course, there's formal training through the Dart Center, which is fantastic. You can bring this into your newsroom in formal or informal ways, or some of both. At the York Daily Record, we created an actual program and a document behind it, and laid out all of these plans and followed a course of action. But it doesn't have to be that deep and detailed. It can be more informal. So you can see some of the things that we've done and that I know others have done to work this into the newsroom culture are down there at the bottom. Highly recommend Elana's TED Talk, by the way. there's an important part about peer support that we should get out there, and these are some bullet points about that. It's not counseling. It's peer support. It's journalist to journalist. Journalists understand what other journalists do and how they may react to the difficulties of the job, and that kind of peer support can be immensely helpful. But it's not the same as counseling, and it shouldn't be considered that way. Nobody is saying that you have to be affected by what you cover or report on, or that you should be, or that something's wrong if you're not. It's not that at all. And we wouldn't say that you have to talk about it if you are affected. It's, do you want to? It's having the opportunity to connect with a colleague who might be able to just help you process or help you through a difficult period of time. And so in closing, I just put a couple things on here about feedback that we've gotten over the years. We worked in New York with a clinical psychologist named Kathy Jansen, and you can see, and she got into, she was the head of the critical incident stress management team in York County. It was actually a multi-county team, and she got into that and got into psychology because she was an EMT, and she kept asking herself, why does it always help when we get together and talk about this stuff? And so that's what she says. There was a sheriff's lieutenant who was immensely helpful to us early on, and he I thought had a great way of framing why this works and why I think it's important in newsrooms. And then we did a training. Bruce actually came down to Westchester in Philadelphia, and we did a training for about 22 journalists early when we started this program. And at the end of it, he asked, for a one-word description, and you see them there at the bottom. And I think that's something that all of us would want anyone in our newsrooms to feel, as the result of an effort to build our skills and to get better at what we do. So that's what I have, and hopefully we'll be able to get in discussion later, and I'll turn it over to the other presenters, and I'll try to get out of this, get out of sharing my screen here.
Okay, thank you.
So
thank you
so
so much.
Awesome, thank you.
All right, before we move on to the next presenter, just to remind everybody, if you have any questions, any tips, any stories, please utilize the chat button icon that's in your right-hand corner right there. We have our Q&A session at the end of the presentation, so feel free to send any questions through there. You can send privately through organizers only, and only I receive them, and we can do that at the end of the session. So the next person we're going to move forward to is it Naseem?
Yes.
Okay, Naseem, go ahead.
Hi there. Thank you so much for having me. I wanted to talk a little bit about peer support today. I helped create the Journalists Covering Trauma Facebook group. I'm a reporter at the Orlando Sentinel. So just to start, I wanted to tell you that I've been in this business for a little over 15 years, and I really didn't think about mental health and journalism much until the Pulse shooting happened here in Orlando, and 49 people were senselessly killed. And of course, once you're at the midst of it, you have this adrenaline rush, but afterward things start sinking in. And it wasn't until about a year later when I connected with another reporter in San Antonio Express News, Sylvia Foster Frau, and we started talking on Facebook about how we had these weird feelings we had never talked about, or we weren't sure why we were holding on to certain things from the shootings, like events that happened, or really little items that we had with us on the day that these things happened. So we decided to start a Facebook group, and we called it Journalists Covering Trauma. And at the time, I don't know if you guys remember, unfortunately, there were so many mass shootings, it seemed like they were happening back to back. Newsrooms were sending each other's care packages. So as a way to help each other out and remind other reporters that we know what you're going through. So this is a picture of what we sent San Antonio Express News, and Sylvia took the picture and we made it our main photo. So this is our Facebook group. It's closed. You guys are more than welcome to join. There are a couple of questions you have to answer because we're trying to keep the trolls out, of course, but you guys are all welcome. And what we do in this group we started about, sort of talking, and people are still hesitant to share their feelings, of course, but we post a lot of information about mental health, self-care. We sometimes do fundraisers where we want to send care packages to other folks. That's been happening less and less, of course, during this time, but more information. That's sort of a little hub for information sharing. And in a way, as any other Facebook group is, it's like a place where we all know where we have been. We know what some of the issues are of covering traumatic events. And of course, we have a few experts among us who sometimes chime in and help us make sense of whatever issue that's out there. So I wanted to go back to what Scott talked about a little earlier and just remind you as a peer that it's okay if you don't feel okay. I know at the beginning of this pandemic, especially the first month or so, when Florida started getting its first cases and it was nonstop coverage, there were days that I couldn't keep my heart rate down. It was just crazy, and I really hope not to visit those days again. But each of us have a different reaction to what's happening. Each of us have a different level of resilience, and it's okay. You don't have to compare yourself to other people. But what's important is for you to either talk about it or seek help. So don't ignore it. That's the most important thing. So some of the things, again, as Scott talked about it, but really reach out to a friend. If you feel comfortable with your coworkers, maybe pick up the phone. If you have friends in the newsroom, if you like Zoom sessions, do that. I don't say Zoom happy hour because I don't want anybody to use alcohol as a way to sort of deal with their feelings. I don't think that's the healthiest way, but connect with someone, and you'd be surprised how that helps you feel a little lighter. I have reached out to friends, say, hey, do you have a minute to talk, or otherwise, and just at the end of the conversation, no matter what we talk about, whether we vent about something or talk about whatever else that's happening in our lives, it's just helpful to get out of your space for a second. And if you feel like your colleague isn't feeling well and there isn't their usual self, send them a message or pick up the phone and ask them if they're okay. And you're always surprised, you might hear something back, and at least they get to talk to somebody about it. And all you can do as a coworker is listen, which is a skill we all have as journalists. So that could be the best thing you can do for your friends. Another thing is taking advantage of your employee assistance program. I know it's always this abstract thing, but most companies offer them. It's usually an 800 number you can reach out to, and they will help you find resources for counseling and therapy. And if you don't know where it is, maybe since you're here today, take it upon yourself to find out what the number is for it so you can share it with your newsroom. That could help somebody out. And the other thing I learned recently is even one session of therapy could be helpful to you. Maybe if you get to talk to a therapist that is good for you and a good fit, they can even give you some tools and help you kind of make sense of what you're going through. So don't look at therapy as this long-term commitment that you have to go to every day or 5 days a week. Just even one session could be helpful. I wanted to share some resources with you that can better educate you or help you understand a lot of what we go through and the intersection of trauma and journalism. And of course, first and foremost is DART Center for Journalism and Trauma. That's their website. If you have never been there, please go there. There is so much great information on there. I can't talk about it enough. They really explain everything very well and have a lot of great tip sheets. Pointer has a course, Journalism and Trauma, here that it's free, it's self-directed. Again, I tried to shorten these links, but if you can write it down and take a picture of the screen, or you can just go on Pointer and find it for yourself. And it not only talks about how to interview people who have been through traumatic events, which is really important, but also how to take care of yourself. The IJ Notes podcast, which is a podcast of International Journalist Network, their last 5 episodes have been about journalism and mental health. And I've listened to them and I found them super helpful. They talk to reporters, they talk to experts, the mental health counselors. So, and each of them are about 25, 30 minutes. So I think it's worth your time to listen to it. And the latest issue of IRE Journal, if you're a member, you can get it for free, but it has a lot of great anecdotes from journalists and also some information and tips on self-care and mental health. So again, if you're a member, you can download it for free. If you're not a member, you can get it for $20. So it's another option. And our group has put out a tip sheet together with advice from the journalists in the group. So it's a pretty long tip sheet with a whole bunch of links to different resources and advice and story ideas. So here's their link again. You don't have to be part of the Facebook group, of course, to get it. Please feel free to go in, save it for yourself, and share it with your coworkers. And if you have any questions, this is how you can reach me. And with that, I'll pass it on to Elana. Thank you.
Before we get started, Elana, I just want to remind everybody again to please send any questions you have to us using the chat icon in the corner. Again, you can send it privately to the organizer only. So go ahead, Elana, take it away.
Okay, give me 1 second to share my screen, and I will be right there. Okay. Can you confirm that you can see this? Yes, good. Okay, thank you. Okay, I'm really excited to be here and talk with you all. And I want to just start by saying that I really do think that Scott and Naseem are leaders in the field. I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm not a journalist. I've been working with journalists for over 20 years. But I think that Scott has demonstrated how to create a formal peer support network, and Naseem has demonstrated how to create an informal, effective peer support network. And they both are models for me of what it means to be a peer supporter and what it means to be a good colleague to each other. So I'm just honored to be here with all of you and to be here with them. So I'm going to talk a little bit right now and do a little more background, if I can get my slides to go. They're not. I could talk about this all day. I want to very, very briefly back up and talk a little bit about what we know about trauma and journalist mental health, share a couple warning signs for mental health. And what I think I mostly want to focus on is tips for mental and physical well-being. As both Scott and Naseem have talked about, this is a really stressful time on top of all the regular kinds of things and stressors and trauma stressors. The pandemic has challenged your craft and has made it difficult. So I'm going to really focus on that and go very, very quickly through this. As Scott mentioned, you know, he was part of a week-long fellowship. So I'm just going to hit the high points here. And I guess I want to point out, first of all, that stress is not necessarily bad. In fact, stress, if I were not a little bit stressed at the moment and aroused, I would be really boring to listen to. So that it's really important that we think about stress as our friend. It is when it continues, if you look at this curve, and when it goes on for a long time, that it's problematic. And I think we just need to remember that it's okay to have some stress some of the time, and I think we forget that. Burnout is that condition that's related to when you have so much work, a lot of institutional stress. It's not trauma related, and usually it's seen by total exhaustion, true cynicism or distancing yourself from work, and just feeling really, really ineffective. And that's a condition any worker can have. And I certainly think it is a problem in the industry. There's actually only been one study done on burnout in journalists, but you see it, you know it. I want to talk a little bit more and differentiate that from trauma. And you folks, 80 to 100% of all journalists, no matter what your beat are, tend to cover and tend to be confronted with trauma. And across a bunch of studies, I'd say that at least the mean is 4 events of trauma at minimum for most reporters. And that's general reporters, all sorts of beats. The way we think about trauma is that there's being on the scene, the work that Naseem talked about with Pulse. There's also the enormous threat, abuse, and harassment. And right now, as we cover elections and particularly political gatherings, the dangers that are there for journalists. So there's the direct threats. There's the online harassment. Then there's simply, if you are truly engaged with your sources that have been trauma exposed with empathy, that's we call it vicarious trauma. If you are truly empathetically engaged with your sources, it can't help but affect you both in positive and negative ways that you have reactions. There's all sorts of exposure now for graphic imagery. There's moral kinds of traumas where you see indignities and injustices. There are also aspects of those I have under trauma that interact with our own personal history and identity. To be a person of color, covering stories about color and institutional racism. And then these add up over time. So there's lots of kinds of traumas that we talk about. And there are all sorts of reactions. And I made a list here of some common ones, but there are all sorts of reactions. There's nightmares, there's feeling jumpy, there's, reviewing the event in a way that doesn't leave you for a while. Feeling numb. In an extreme, sometimes even just not remembering parts of it. Trouble sleeping, isolation, disorientation. You can have extreme feelings, feeling angry, feeling shameful, feeling guiltful. You can have stomach pain, headaches, dry mouth. You can have all sorts of reactions. It's not unusual after you've gone through something intense to have reactions. And most of the time they dissipate, but sometimes they don't. I like to talk about trauma reactions, although as a researcher and the stuff I'm about to show you, we look at PTSD. And the only point of this slide is that PTSD is a specific syndrome, and we often use it as a sub way to talk about trauma reactions, and they're not the same. To have PTSD, you have to have one of these, two of these, one of these. It has to interfere. And what I really want to talk about is trauma reactions, because that's the larger issue. But I do want to say that on the one hand, PTSD is an issue for journalists. If you look at these numbers, in community samples, the rate of PTSD is usually a lifetime among men is 3.6, among women it's 9.7. So you look at these numbers here and you say, oh, on the one hand, it's a little higher for men. On the other hand, given that 80 to 100% of journalists are exposed, looks like journalists are pretty darn resilient. But this is an occupational hazard, and that's some of what my work looks at. But in any case, I want to point out that journalists are resilient. And in spite of the high trauma, it's comparatively low mental health disorders at the disorder level, but we all have reactions that need to be managed, and that's what I want to focus on. So what keeps people resilient? Here are some factors. One of them is having a strong moral compass and integrity. And I like to focus on this because journalism ethics, being a good ethical journalist, is actually a resiliency factor. And I think that's important to remember. For people who to bounce back after stress is having a sense of mission or purpose. And again, that's something that I think is really important for journalists to remember. And I encourage journalists to think about why they do the work they do and even put up a mission statement to remind yourself when things get tough about why you do the work you do. I consider myself a journalist ally because I so value the work that you all do and the meaning of it. Trainings, just like today, you're spending an hour and a half of your time coming in. Any kind of training in your field keeps you resilient. Having a sense of transcendence, whether that's formal religion, whether it's a sense of spirituality, whether it's feeling one with nature. Those are the things to nurture and that can help you continue to be resilient. Trying to keep optimistic, that sense of humor and that sense of a fighting spirit. Now, I'm not talking about being Pollyanna-ish here, but really trying to look onto the brighter side of things, trying to see that. I've double said a strong sense of meaning and purpose as a journalist, because I guess I like that point so much, so we could ignore that. And I think one of the things that Naseem and Scott really focused on is the importance of a supportive community. That's both from management, and that's why it's so important to have workplace programs, because people who perceive organizational support do better. I think the other point with peer support is that it can also be support from intimate others, having support more generally. But it's not just receiving support, but it's giving support. And I think people tend to forget that when they think about social support, that when you're down and out, that reaching out to someone and doing something kind to somebody else is really also effective. And then finally, I want to just remind people, I don't like the word social distancing, Because yes, it is not the same, but we are physically distancing from each other. We're not socially distancing from each other. We can still be in relationship to each other, although it does require assertively reaching out. And I guess I just wanted to point that out. So those are some general ideas. And then I want to talk about a few more, and then I hope we'll be able to have some conversations. So when I think about general self-care strategies and tools, I think about driving a car. A car needs gas, right, to go from one place to another. And then it needs maintenance. And we're pretty good, or at least I'll speak for me because I'm not a great person who takes care of my car. I always remember to put in gas. I need reminders to do my maintenance. And every so often it needs maintenance. And so I like to think about self-care in that same way, that we need to have our strategies that put fuel in us, and then we need to our maintenance, and we need to check that we're keeping up with our maintenance every so often. So when thinking about those maintenance kinds of things, I think the most important thing is to know yourself. People cope differently. And if all of you, I'd ask you to imagine a time in the past where you had difficulty. If you think about how you coped, you can pretty much appraise, okay, what I did that was pretty adaptive and helpful to me was this. And, I ate too much, I drank too much. A few of the things that weren't so good. And that you think about this plan, the plan that Scott talked about, that you think about, okay, what should I do a little more of and what should I do a little less of when I'm stressed? And thinking about your signature strengths. What can you use to your advantage? And we all come into the world with pre-existing vulnerabilities, whether that's medical, whether that's mental health. And we need to remember that when we're down and out and when we're feeling stressed, when we're having trouble, that we need to address some of those pre-existing vulnerabilities and make a plan. What works? Lots of things work. But calming activities are one. One of the things that is most important when you're feeling stressed is to try to lower your autonomic arousal, so your excitement. And there are lots of strategies for that. There's breathing, just taking a deep breath all the way from your stomach. There's meditation, there's stretching, imagery, using an image of being in a safe place or putting a battle shield around you. There's restorative activities, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. Exercise, sleep. There are things that are fun, that distract you from work. There are activities that connect you to others. And I think Naseem already talked about avoiding self-medication. That's a strategy. And Scott mentioned having a self-care plan or practice, really thinking about, okay, what is it that I need to do? If you know that you're going to be covering something, you can do the before, during, or after. If you don't, you can have a general plan of here's some things that I need to work on. Celebrating attainable victories. And then meaning making. And I must say that the data on gratitude is so compelling, but I didn't start until COVID. I actually now at the end of the day write 2 things that I'm grateful for. And I have to say that that has really helped me maintain optimism. And it may even be something as simple as, I'm healthy today, or I'm thankful my computer worked. I mean, some days are like that. But it has really helped me maintain that optimism, because I think it is very hard to be optimistic under current conditions. So I think that's important. I think the other thing to think about in self-care activities are recovery time. And it turns out that, if you think about, I'm not a weightlifter, but my understanding when I was doing weights is that I needed to do them and take a day of rest so that the muscles could do that. I don't know actually all the reasons why, but it is a biological fact that you strain, you exercise, and then you rest so that you can build up more muscle. And the same thing is true for self-care. Is there's more and more evidence saying that you need to recover so that you can work more effectively. And the kinds of things that help you recover are activities that provide support, that strengthen, that increase your relaxation, that provide challenge, that replenish and recharge you, and change how you think about work. So when you're thinking about things to take care of yourself, that's important. I just want to mention that everybody sometimes needs a tune-up, and sometimes you need some help with those strategies. You might need to see a professional, even as, Naseem said, for, once just to get a tune-up. But when do you need extra help? When you're really having extreme trouble sleeping, you're finding that you have suicidal thoughts, if you are really unable to concentrate for long times, your depression is really bad, and also if you have pre-existing vulnerabilities and ongoing stress. So sometimes you need more help or you need to tune up, but most of the time there are a lot of things. Before I close and we start talking about other aspects of this, I do want to mention technology, and particularly now, here we are, instead of meeting in person, we're meeting over GoToMeetings. Our lives are all now in technology, and we very much need it. But I think it's important that one of the things to do is to really think about your use of technology and set up some boundaries. Our lives are now so intertwined, and the boundaries are so permeable, and it's so hard. Many of you are working at home, finding ways to create space. You're taking care of children going to school. There's all sorts of things that it's really important. There are ways in which technology is great, and there are ways that it really compounds and makes our stressors work and makes it harder to have a work-family balance. So thinking about your use of technology, putting your iPhone down and setting up some control over it, I really think is helpful. So the last thing I want to do before I turn it over is I've just sort of rambled very quickly, but I really want to close with inviting you to commit to one self-care activity you will do this week, that you will do consciously and enthusiastically. And I want to invite you to say, okay, here's one thing that I really need to do a little more of, and I'd like to do that this week. So I will close with that, and we can then have a conversation. I will turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Elana. Thank you, Scott, Naseem, and Elana. This is our time for Q&A and conversations. In the middle of all this, again, I invite you to leave any questions in the chat button right there. We'll get to them. So first of all, I just want to get started perhaps. We talked a lot about COVID right now, especially working from home, as most of us are doing that. So we're more isolated. We're more, working from home and just being isolated from all that, from our coworkers, from any kind of connections. Do you guys have any tips on how we can deal with working from home, and especially on how to improve your work week? What are some tips you would share with people about that?
I can start if you want.
I can toss out something new, and I've heard this from several other reporters that I work with as well, and Elana was kind of getting at that in her last slide, but do try to set boundaries, and maybe it's something where I don't know who's on this call, whether there are a lot of editors or staffers or a mix or whatever, but if it's something you need to discuss and talk about with your supervisor, it might be worth doing that, to say, look, at this time every day, I'm going to close my computer and I'm going to turn my phone off and I'm not going to be available. And if you can work something like that out, or if you can have that open conversation, I think that would be helpful. I know that people that I've worked with, and I've tried to do the same thing, if I can, at 6 o'clock, I'll shut the laptop. I know I might have to come back to it later, but there's that act of disengaging at that point. And I know another editor that I worked with, every couple of days or a few days, especially during the first height of COVID, would send a message out and say, I'm going to be offline for an hour. I'm taking a walk around the neighborhood. I'll be back in an hour, and something like that.
Some of the ideas, I've been holding a lot of workshops with people about these kinds of things. So I think what Scott has talked about is having a routine, really setting up some boundaries, but it can be hard, particularly for those of you in cramped quarters. So some other suggestions that people have suggested is, for those of you, I've been doing a lot of this in New York, where at the time where COVID was really bad and people couldn't leave their one-bedroom apartments and were working. So the tips that journalists suggested were things as simple as they lit a candle when they weren't working in their house so that they were able to have a smell associated with relaxation time as opposed to having it be there. They would actually cover their computer, or they would take a shower at the end of the day to indicate that they were a way to sort of force some of those boundaries. And I thought those were really helpful suggestions. Having a routine as much as you can and a start and stop time can help with some of those boundaries.
Okay, thank you. Here's a question for Scott or Elana, or for both of you if you want to answer it. Is there any advice for how reporters can talk about their own stress and burnout to editors? How can they approach their supervisors with these concerns?
Go for it, Scott.
I was hoping you would start. This is one reason why I would like to see, more newsrooms really make trauma awareness and peer support part of their culture, because I think when it is part of your culture, those conversations are much easier to have. And if it's not part of your culture and you're dealing with a supervisor who you don't think would understand, then I don't have to tell you that, you're in a tough situation. But I think being honest about it is really the only way that you can go. And ultimately, if you can find the common ground with your editor or your supervisor, you both want to do the best work you can. You both want to make your newsroom as good as it can be. You both want to serve your community as well as you can. And maybe you can say something like, the stress that I'm feeling or have been feeling for the last couple of weeks, I feel like is really preventing me from doing that, and I need to do something differently. And can we work together to figure out, a different schedule, or like the boundaries that Elana was talking about, or I need a break, or something like that. And the idea is, can we work together to help us get to the same goal? I honestly would be surprised in this era right now with what we're all dealing with. If you went to a supervisor or an editor and you said that, I would be surprised if that supervisor wouldn't say back to you, I feel the same way. And you would have a conversation. You start to have a conversation about, okay, how can we problem solve this? And if you can get to that point, then I think that's where you want to be, and then you can try to start to figure things out.
Elana, did you have anything else to add?
I don't. I think, this is a question that comes across a lot on the platform that Naseem monitors and creates. And this is like the big question. And I think it's a matter of establishing what's comfortable for you, but really being able to say those kinds of things and indicate that you need help. And my own view is that the other part of this is, if it's extreme enough, it's part of a protected right. I know that it's very hard this time because of the news business and people don't want to expose their vulnerabilities, but there are laws that protect people who aren't freelancers. So I do want to acknowledge that there are issues here, but if someone is part of an organization, that you have family leave, you have certain rights that you can self-identify for as well.
Right, thank you. Here's another question too, and kind of related to that too. How would you approach coworkers about discussion about trauma and stress? I'm assuming that means your other coworkers as opposed to supervisors. How would you approach other people in your company about these concerns?
Be interested to hear from Naseem how it works where you are. Naseem, how that might work.
Well, I mean, I have, I think in the past when we had a newsroom, we were one of the newsrooms who lost its building during the pandemic. So I don't know when we're going to have a newsroom actually, but before the pandemic, where there was, I personally kind of took it upon myself to reach out to some of the other reporters that you sort of don't know too well, but you see them everywhere, every day. And you just feel like they're not their usual self. And I'm like, I don't care if this person thinks I'm being rude or nosy, but I drop them a note and say, hey, I just feel like you're not feeling perfectly well. Is there anything I can do? Are you okay? And, you know, they sort of a little maybe brushed me off, but I thought from my side, I thought at least I had reached out to them to offer them some help if they were going to take it. So it's up to you, but I feel like it never hurts to reach out to somebody as a colleague, as you know, you don't have to be best buddies to have that conversation. We all have colleagues that we don't work with every day if you're in different teams, but it's something good to do for your coworkers, and I guess for yourself to know that you care about your colleagues.
Thank you, Naseem. This is a follow-up question about the newsroom culture. So what can reporters do to change the newsroom culture to be more attuned to mental health issues?
I think just listening to what Naseem said, I'll just throw a couple thoughts out there. I mean, you know, that Facebook group and that supportive community is a big deal. And if you can join and participate in that, then you begin to have some conversation starting points, I think, with others in your newsroom, whether that's colleagues like staff level or even editors. And you can say, I'm part of this group and we were talking about this thing. And, you know, our newsroom went through the same thing 6 months ago, but we've never really talked about that. You know, I wonder if we could get everybody together and just talk about that coverage we did and what we learned and all that. And you start to bring it into your newsroom just as something that you begin to pay attention to and to talk about. Again, just like you would talk about why was that a good headline, or why was that a good story, or why was that a good video, or whatever. It's the same thing. It's just talking about this very specific, these very specific issues. So I would find ways like that to bring it into the conversation. And then the other thing I would say is, well, two things. One, building off what Naseem said about reaching out to a colleague, and even if they brush you off, I feel like the existence of something is important, whether somebody responds to it or not. And I'll bet you anything that the people that Naseem reached out to that kind of brushed her off, still somewhere inside felt valued and felt good that she had done that. And I think that's important. And then the other thing is, if people are wondering how to start a conversation with other people in their newsroom, that's one way to do it. If you have a colleague, if you have had difficulty with a story and you see a colleague going to cover what you know is a difficult story, go to them and say, that story must have been really difficult to cover. Tell me how it went. And just doing that, I think you start this conversation that opens it up, you know, for then the two of you, and then perhaps to grow, you know, across the newsroom.
Yeah, and I think to build on that, you know, I try to read our newspaper every day, and I know those of us who work in the newsroom don't read our newspapers every day, but I try to make a point to do it. And really, like, all you have to do, like in the morning, sometimes when I read a story from a colleague that has a funny quote or is a great story, just send a quick email. Loved your story. This is great, especially right now, since we are not in the newsrooms. We don't see each other every day. You can pass by somebody's desk and say, hey, that was great. Just take that 1 minute and send that little note. Because I know personally, I would appreciate it if when somebody sends me a note, say, hey, I like your story today, or good work. Or if somebody tweets it with a sort of congratulatory note, who's my colleague, who knows me, you know, aside from strangers on Twitter. So I think that makes a good difference. And another thing I wanted to bring up, and it's a little more challenging, of course, today, is what started with the care packages that newsrooms were sending during the mass shootings. And with that, one thing we started to do in our newsroom, and my editors have been very supportive and very open to talk about these issues, of course, is every once in a while, we would bring in some Play-Doh. So people would take it to their desks, and we'll bring in like slingies or little tops you could spin. There are so many like fidget toys, all these little things. They're silly toys, but it's good stress relievers. And who doesn't love the smell of the Play-Doh? It takes you back to your childhood. So I know these days it's a little tougher to ask for people's home addresses to send a coworker maybe a little care package, but that's an option if you know where your colleagues live and you want to reach out. Just put a few of these silly toys from Target or Walmart and send it to them. There's so many ways you can sort of make a gesture to your peers, you know, to let them know you're thinking about them, even if you don't see them.
Those are great tips. I love the idea about Play-Doh. I would probably go out and buy some Play-Doh myself later and just play at home. But here's another question here. So what are some warning signs that a reporter needs help beyond what an editor is capable of handling themselves? So if something that editor themselves can't handle, what are some warning signs that a reporter needs help outside of that?
Should I start with that one?
Go ahead.
So I think, you know, if someone, if an editor talks to someone and they don't notice a change, a person is really very, very late with assignments, there's a change in behavior. There's an abrupt change in behavior, and you've raised it once or twice, and things aren't changing, that's the time that I think is time to get some support help. If the person is clearly having and says they have an ongoing health or mental health disorder that's complicating things, that's a time to probably seek help. If the person's suicidal or homicidal, that would obviously be a time. I'm trying to think of other situations. I think those are the ones that come to mind immediately. That's part of the training that we do in formal peer support, is when an editor is over their head or when a peer supporter is over their head. Did I miss any warning signs off the top of my head, either of you? Okay.
Thank you, Elana. Here's another question too. What are some security steps that journalists can take to protect themselves from disgruntled subjects of reports, particularly any crime reporters when they're out there reporting on those kind of topics?
I don't know, I can jump in. I don't know how productive this will be, but we've talked about and we've actually committed to recently, if we have a protest or something like that in our community, we're going to send 2 people and not 1. So you send a backup. I mean, that's one thing. And then so this isn't exactly the same thing as what the person is asking, but in terms of again, in terms of going into these public rally situations, we bought some protective gear, some reflective vests, face gas masks, things that we think will help protect our reporters if they are in a situation where they feel threatened or may be threatened. But I don't know. Naseem, do you have any better options for people who may feel like they're going to get turned on by sources after particular stories?
No, I mean, I think you covered it. It's unfortunately the nature of our business these days, and sometimes things do turn dangerous. But definitely share your concerns with your editors if there is an assignment. And I think coupling people together is a great idea.
Elana, is there anything else you want to add or no? Okay. This last question here is, I want to talk more about burnout, especially Elana, you touched upon this too, about digital fatigue, always being on. Are there any tips, I know we're from Elana, but from you, Scott or Naseem, about how to deal with burnout, especially when you're working from home and you're surrounded by other duties, that's homeschooling, your own house, the politics, economy. What are some tips that you want to share with others about that as well?
So, I mean, I think one of the things that Elana talked about, the signs of burnout, that resonates with me is when you get to a point that you sort of don't care and, you don't get excited about your work, or you're like, well, what's the point of all this? And the thing I've done that works for me, I've asked for some time off, and I have time off, thankfully. So, and my editors are understanding, but I have said, is it possible for me to take a couple of days off And really during those couple of days, I try to do as little as possible. And that's what works for me. Whatever that lifts your spirit, do that thing. But for me, it's just binge watching some show, or maybe do my hobbies, or just hang out. And it's amazing how that little bit of time gives you some energy, some to come back and look at things differently. And the other thing that I try to remind myself when I get really tired, and again, Elana mentioned this, is you remind yourself why you're doing what you're doing. I mean, we are really documenting the first draft of history, and this is an incredible year we are living through. So what you write and what you do really matters. It's going down history about what's happening in your community. And I don't know about you guys, but we are a local paper, so we are all covering the same thing. So sometimes you see large national papers covering the stories in so much more depth, with so much bigger experts, and you're like, well, my story probably wouldn't matter as much because they have the big guy from the big university, but it does. You talk to your community. It's your community and you're covering it. So try to remind yourself of that there are readers who appreciate what you do, even if you only hear from the complainers. But know that what you do matters. So those are my two tips that have worked for me so far in this crazy year.
I would say everything Naseem said, co-sign all of that, and then add maybe, the idea of cognitive reappraisal. There are a lot of challenges that have been put on everyone by having to work from home, but there are some positive things that come from that as well. For me, I have an hour commute, except I haven't had an hour commute since March. And that's time that I use in different ways now at home, or time with my family. And so if you can consciously think about the positive things, that can help. It may not be the cure, but it can help. And I love Elana's tip about writing down 2 things at the end of the day that you're grateful for. I mean, anything like that you can build into your routine to allow your brain to focus on positive things will, I think, is helpful.
Thank you. We have one more last question come in, but this is probably for Naseem and Scott, but it kind of goes back to what we were talking about as far as, covering protests or covering some hard subjects. But do you see journalists now addressing how security is being used in light of the news of that journalist security guard that was recently, that shooting that occurred there? Do you feel like that's more of any thoughts of that, as far as, do you think there'd be more security involved for having journalists, when they're out there covering stories, having security with them when they're doing that? Or is that something that should be part of the job, having security with you?
Naseem, you guys might be in a better position. We haven't gotten to that point. We've gotten to the point of getting gear. We haven't gotten to the point of talking about physical security, but maybe Orlando has.
No, we haven't either. I mean, we have had some protests here, and there have been some aggression, but not extreme aggression, thankfully, to our reporters. But I don't know. It's unfortunate that we are at the time, because usually it was your press badge that was your security. But times have changed, but we have not talked about that. So I don't know.
I'll just tag on a point there. I've been doing a lot of work with the security folks, and I do the psychological side. I don't do anything about the security, don't know a lot about security, but I'm learning. But I do think this notion of what you're asking for, too, is really having both a physical and a psychological before, during, and after plan. And even this question is, I think, an important one. How am I going to be safe? What are the best things to do? And I would actually encourage you to expand it to thinking about psychological safety. If I am hurt, what would I do before, during, and after? And that needs to be part of your physical security plan. And more safety planning is doing that. So I'll just throw that in there.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you for your questions. I'm just going to pass on to Mary then.
Okay, thank you, New. I appreciate it. That will conclude this session. As I said again, I will be sending the recording link to this in a communication early next week, and we have received permission from our speakers. Thank you for us to be able to send out the presentation decks from today, so you can have those as a resource to you. So I want to thank you, our moderator and our speakers, Newman, Naseem, Elana, and Scott. We greatly appreciate your time and your expertise. And thank you again to all of you, our attendees, for joining us today. And I hope you have a lovely remainder of your day.
Thanks, everybody.